Hello, thank you for coming. I'm Andrew. I'm a tech manager at PickBook and the lead programmer on Agent Intercept. But since I've been a tech manager for the last year, I've done less and less programming, so a lot of the things that I talk about, I might imply that I did, but actually it was my team. And I talk today about Agent Intercept, about the decisions that went into building it, and particularly about why we decided not to use a physics engine and what consequences, good and bad, that had. I'll quickly go over my background, then over the background of Agent Intercept and the concepts behind it. Some of the early constraints that we identified that started our development journey, which will lead into what happened when we tried using physics, what happened when we decided not to use physics, and then what happened when the designers got involved. I'm going to aim to have time for questions at the end, but we'll see how that goes. This is my first time doing this talk. It's going to be a bit all over the show. So I did a neuroscience degree. It went a bit wrong. I started a PhD, it went a lot wrong because I kept on getting distracted by things like PlayStation Homebrew. But that worked out really well because I leveraged that into a job at She Interactive. And then after a couple of years, absconded to Norway and made Flash games for a while. Then went over to London and joined Rocksteady Studios and used that Flash experience to work on the UI for the Batman games. Also did some boss AI and some forensics and some getting married and some having children and some realizing that living on the other side of the world in a small flat with 2 small children and no family support is a bit shit. So about 6 years ago we came back to New Zealand and I started work again at She Interactive, which was now called PickBook. And since then I worked on Rival Stars College Football, Zombie Rescue Squad and Agent Intercept. Wait, Agent Intercept, I hear you imply with your silence. Tell us more. So this was originally pitched as a Spy Hunter remake to Warner Brothers 2009, I think, when they acquired the Midway back catalogue. And they didn't bite. But then 10 years later, we had the opportunity to pitch a launch title for Apple Arcade. And not very much time to get that pitch together. And so we did the here's one we prepared earlier thing. And they liked it, and we just launched straight in. Sorry, I keep on drumming on this thing and it makes noises. Like many studios, we use 3 experience pillars per title to guide our development. And these were the ones that we used for Agent Intercept. Of them, the second one is the one that I think affected me the most in how I approached it. It felt a lot like being back on the Batman games where there's the default assumption of excellence. Any player should be able to pick up the game, immediately feel like a competent, heroic spy, but still have space to develop and become a truly exceptional super spy or superhero or vigilante. Yeah. So the inspiration of the game obviously started with Spy Hunter, old school, but Spy Hunter was itself inspired by James Bond, but we wanted to make it even more James Bondy and more Jason Bourne-y. And then for our repitch, 10 years later, we added some more modern references like Fast and Furious and Fury Road. Obviously not hitting the PG family-friendly one with that, but you know the feel of it, as well as the things that do hit the tonal PG thing like Cars 2 and Mask, which no one but me and Rick remembers. It was awesome, so good. I made everyone watch a couple of episodes. We were building this for Apple Arcade, which meant that it had to work for touch on the iPhone and with the Siri remote for the Apple TV. So that meant we didn't have the option of having a whole controller worth of inputs. So approaching this task of minimizing the input, the way that the player interacted with the game, we identified that if we just had left and right and gadgets and boost, that would not only work for this controller, but also work quite well for that family-friendly, playable by kids pillar. And we figured that conceptually, you're a super spy. You are flooring the accelerator all the time. That's not a control you need to give to the player if they never take their foot off it. And they're not going to break, because that would be lame. Right, cinematic considerations. Over the years, I've worked on a lot of projects where we used code-based systems to control the movement of objects and cameras. And a recurring problem has been, eventually in development, you hit a point where the artists and the animators want to control stuff in a way that you haven't allowed for. And you end up having to build exceptions into your control system that cause you just so many problems. So this time, we decided, right from the beginning, we were not going to have that problem. We were going to build a system that would allow us to seamlessly transition between gameplay and cinematic experiences. The goal of this was to give maximum flexibility to the artistic people, to let them play with time and show off the explosions and just swoop low for the sexy telephoto shots. And we called this system the VMB. And this is a silly name, but it's a carefully chosen silly name because it speaks to what the system is supposed to do. And when you can get everyone on the team on board with the idea, with the feeling that we're supposed to evoke, it really helps just guide everyone in the right direction and minimize the number of times that someone puts something in that just doesn't work very well. Oh, and we have a system for delivering snappy dialogue in our briefings, and that is called the virtual Quentin Tarantino. So the VMB was designed to express gameplay in the language of a movie director. So when the car passes this point on the track, I want the camera to swing up and frame the pyramid as the particle cannon comes out at the top of it, and then I want to track down as the beam shoots out and blows up this part of the road just as this enemy comes in and happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It looked quite complicated. I don't actually know how it works because that was someone else's job. But it works. Gameplay. Okay, so I felt early on that Unity physics was probably not going to be the direction that we were going to want to go. A physics engine gives you a lot, but some of the things that it gives you aren't necessarily things that you want. A game like Gran Turismo is physics heavy and realistic, but we didn't want realism. We wanted big jumps, we wanted mid-air control, we wanted never landing upside down, because that's the Super Spy experience. Rocket League's got big jumps, and that's a very physicsy game, and it's a lot of fun. But a lot of the fun in Rocket League comes from being bounced around like a ping pong ball and feeling that chaos, and we didn't want chaos. We wanted grounded, except when you're jumping, and we wanted sort of Vin Dieseling around corners perfectly and just taking out baddies. Sorry, I've not done a very good job preparing notes. But we tried using physics anyway. One of the other programmers knocked together a quick prototype. As expected, it was up and running and pretty good pretty quickly, but it fell down in two areas, even though it was generally nice to drive and slide around. And the two areas were collisions, especially when you had a bunch of cars smashing together at once. Every so often one of them would just shoot off into space. And it's the wrong sort of unrealistic. And the other one was curved corners. And and getting that feeling of just grinding around a corner smoothly was really hard to do when your world is made up of a bunch of planes rather than an actual curve. It felt fixable, but it felt like something that was going to require a lot of tweaking of interdependent variables and was going to be difficult to come back from if we made the wrong decisions early on. Before I talk about the alternatives to physics, I want to briefly touch on player input. There's two ways to approach player input, either as the goal or as the means, and UX people probably have better words for describing this. But if you think of a game like Gran Turismo, your stick is the means of control. You hold it left, it turns the wheels left, and those left turning wheels feed into the simulation to change how it works. If you think of a fighting system, it works completely the opposite way. The input is the goal. If I point the stick over there, sorry Tim, and I hit the attack button, then that tells the system that I want to move in the sensiblest way to Tim and attack him in the most impressive way possible. Sorry. Arcade car games sometimes do this as well. Mario Kart does it. When you hit left, that doesn't mean turn the cart's wheels left. That means I want the cart to go left. I don't care what surface I'm on. I don't care where the weight is shifted. Just turn the damn car left. Right. Anyway, how do you make a game where you are driving a car and traversing around a racetrack with things to collide with without using a physics system? At what point do you end up doing so much maths yourself that it would have been more efficient and better development-wise to just have used the physics system and cut the bits out that you didn't want? And how can you know enough about what your finished game is going to look like at the point where you're making these decisions? These are good questions to ask and really hard ones to answer. We started out by sketching out the behavior that we thought we were going to want in the gameplay, and then making a series of gut calls about what we should do. And then over the next couple of months, we fleshed out the gameplay, built the basics of these systems, and then continually evaluated what we had built by asking that question: would we be better off just dumping this, starting again with a physics engine? One of the questions we asked, one of the things we identified first was that although we're operating in a 3D world, driving is mostly 2D, especially in real life. We navigate X and Z. If Y is a major consideration, things have generally gone quite wrong. And so our first couple attempts at making this game, we pretty much stuck to plane navigation. The car has a forwards direction, we apply speed there, we apply a braking force to any sideways movement. And it's great for open spaces. It's not so good for twisty roads because you end up hitting the wall. And in a game where you don't have a reverse button and you're always driving forwards, hitting the wall and getting stuck and then having to Austin Powers your way back to pointing the right direction sucks. It doesn't feel like a super spy. Yeah. And it got even harder when we tried to add drift in, because drift physics are really, really tricky. Tires are designed to go forwards and not go sideways. That's their job. Drifting involves making your tires not do their job right. And it's quite complicated. But as this graph clearly shows, once that threshold of motion, that graph doesn't make any sense. As this graph shows, as force increases, the friction increases to match it, and this is the point where the tire isn't slipping. But at some point, you reach this threshold of motion where the static friction is no longer enough to stop the tire from moving sideways, and it starts moving, and then you switch into kinetic friction. And kinetic friction doesn't really change based on the force that you're putting into the system, and it's lower than that maximum static friction. And you'll know this if you've ever tried to move a big piece of furniture, and you're pushing and pushing, and the bastard won't move, and then you just push that little bit more, and it slips, and it doesn't just start moving; it starts accelerating, and you end up falling on your face if you've done it wrong. Blah. Oh yes, and that threshold, that changes if you shift weight around the car, or if your back wheels are spinning so they've lost some of their forwards traction, or if it's a different surface. It's really complicated and it's really difficult, and we tried it anyway, and it kind of worked, but again, it didn't really work for narrow bits. Fishtailing looks really cool in a big open area, but if you end up facing the wrong way, you don't feel like Jason Bourne. So how do we keep you on the road? We thought about whether we should just have a spline running down the middle of the road that just pulls you back on track. And then we thought, when you're driving down the Hutt Road, you don't feel like you're driving on a plane. You feel like you're driving in a straight line that's a bit wiggly, but you don't have to concentrate on the wiggliness. You just stick to your lane. All of your decision making is how you strafe, where to go, which lane to be in to get the pickups. And so we decided to try to do our next prototype like this. The road is the z-axis, and the x-axis is from 0 to 1, left and right side of the road. And it worked. It actually worked far too well. It didn't feel like a driving game, it felt like an endless runner. We needed to feel the weight of the car sinking into the corners, and so we thought, what if we turned physics on its head? What if we did that thing that we used to do where we thought that centrifugal force was a real thing and not just centripetal force but backwards? And so we had the corners push the car, and we could scale that push so that when you're driving at your normal speed, the push is not quite enough to take away your ability to climb back out of the corner. But when you're boosting, well, then you're screwed. You're definitely going to the outside, and then you've got decisions to make about when you're boosting. And this felt a lot better. You're all over the road, but still mostly following the road. You don't feel like you're definitely not going to end up ploughing into the wall and turning sideways, but you don't feel like it's taking all your control away. What about drift? Well, what are we actually trying to communicate with drift? What do people know about drift from movies? Drifting is when your car is going fast around a corner and you're going sideways, and you have a bit less control, but you still definitely have control. So we did that. We just chucked a bit of cosmetic rotation onto the car, put some smoke out the back of it, and just reduced the steering force that you had. And this felt right to most people. Some people who actually know about drifting cars said this feels wrong, but it's all right. They're not our target market. I'm going to skip over some of this wall stuff, but basically rigid body physics works by detecting overlaps, applying forces to push things apart. You can end up with juddering when you're trying to simultaneously use the rigid body physics to control whether things are overlapping, but also override things to be more cinematic. So we went for algorithmic walls. All of the sides of our roads are just defined as either straight lines or curves, and we use control points at the corners of the cars. If we know that a point has gone outside of the track, then we can know exactly how much to turn the car in order to pull it back onto track. If both points on a side have gone out of track, we need to also translate the car, not just turn it. Blah blah blah. This ends up with a system where we can nose into the wall and feel like the wall is turning us, and then we're grinding around throwing up sparks to indicate that, sure, this is elegant, but it would be more elegant to stay on the road. But it just kind of works better. We have a collision system. How are we doing? Actually, I think we do have time. So we wanted our collisions to feel like Hollywood collisions. We wanted bad guys to get knocked, spin around a couple of times, and then end up forlornly looking at the camera with smoke coming out of them. You can do that with a physics system, but it requires a lot of tweaking to make sure that you get the right number of spins without sort of sending them over the horizon. Not that they can go over the horizon, because everything's constrained to the track. So we went with a much simpler option. We use the physics collision geo to detect when there have been overlaps, log those overlaps with a collision manager that is in charge of pushing things apart. And we could set that push to be equal to what a physics system would give it, but we keep it a bit lower. And all the death animations, not death, all the defeat animations are just animations that we play once someone has taken enough damage. This is slowed down. So one thing that we tried that actually worked out quite nicely is, rather than pushing things apart enough to make sure that they don't penetrate, let them penetrate just a wee bit, so you get that boxing effect of like the fist hitting the side of the face and the face compressing before turning around, and it makes everything feel heavier. Not more realistic, because there's no obvious damage to the cars, but it added weight to the experience. And there we go, all done. A performant engine that will do everything that our designers could possibly want, right? Right? Have you met designers? Would you like to meet a designer? Rick, could you stand up for a moment? All right. Folks, this is Rick. He's a design manager at Pickpock and the narrative designer on Agent Intercept. Imagine, if you will, coming into work one day, sitting down in a storyboard meeting and having an 8-foot-tall American say something like,
Andrew, I want the car to jump onto a rocket ship, drive up the side of the rocket ship as that rocket ship is blasting into space.
What? So there are obvious reasons why we can't do that. For starters, it's ridiculous. But more importantly, we have a system where the car goes from 0 to 1 on the x-axis. A rocket goes all the way around. We can do this. What we can do is we can have an invisible road that the car is constrained to the middle of, and then we can take the steering force that would be moving the car side to side on that road, and instead use that to rotate a rocket that's underneath the car. And we'll shift the skybox as well. And we'll add in speed lines, we'll add in camera shake. This will work. Yeah, cool. So we should definitely do that again. Any ways that you want to extend that tech?
Yeah, I was talking to the level designers, and we want to, in Return of the Jedi, big like Sarlacc pit, we want that in a non-copyright infringing way, but like we'll make it ourselves with blackjack and spikes coming out and pickups.
Yep.
And you're sledding around the vortex.
That's not extending this existing tech. This is completely different. We do kind of support circular tracks, but we place the pickups on the track. And just driving around and around and around, there's not going to be more pickups, there's not going to be more spikes. Okay, we can do it. Right, so instead of constraining just the X, we'll constrain the Z as well. And then we'll take this cone and we'll turn it on its side and we'll spin it round based on how fast the car is moving forwards, which will be different if they're in the middle versus the outside, because different radii, different circumferences. And yeah, that'll work. It'll just work. And the pickups, we'll just use some like real old tech, 200-year-old tech. We'll take player piano punch tape and we'll let the designers lay that out with these missing materials to define when the spikes pop up, when the pickups appear, it'll be fine. Okay, easy. What else? You want it to fly?
Well, it's not so much that we want it to fly, but that I was talking to the lead designer and we need it to fly.
Okay, this is a 4-button game. We need to hold on to left, right, and gadget. We can't give them up. So we've got 1 button to fly. It's like, I can't think of a single compelling game where you use 1 button to control altitude and anyone wants to play it. Okay, right. We can make this work. I made that. I put those wings in. I thought they were quite good. The artists disagreed. They felt that we needed to go in a slightly different direction with it. And they were right. But it was good. It was surprisingly satisfying having that minimalist flying game. We also made a submarine version where it was like boost to go down, which I thought made perfect sense. But our UX testing showed that that didn't make perfect sense to anyone but me. This happens. Thank you, Rick. It doesn't always work out. Rob wanted to put a bunch of boxes on the back of a flatbed truck and jump the car through them, like in every car chase movie and every second Unity physics tutorial. Our car has no physics velocity, so he'd jump up, hit all the boxes, and then they'd just sort of come out the way. And we could have put in a fix for this. We could have created a trigger that would put a physics impulse in the middle to blow them all apart. But then the rest of the world isn't physicsy either. So now we've got a bunch of flying boxes, and they're going to start intersecting with geo that wasn't designed to ever be intersected with. And so by the time we'd talked through all the options and come up with an alternative, Rob had already put something else in. It didn't matter. Problem went away. Okay. All right. We are doing okay. In conclusion, physics engines are great. They can make your games really realistic. But realism isn't always what you want if you want a Hollywood experience. If you know exactly what your game is going to be, you can design a bespoke system that will perfectly cater for it and will be potentially a lot more efficient and easier to maintain than using a physics system. In the real world, when you only approximately know what your game is going to be, when you make these decisions early on, you create constraints. And sometimes those constraints work out well, and sometimes they don't work out so well. And sometimes those constraints lead you down the path of, oh, this gameplay would work. And you end up with a game that we're quite proud of. And we are doing well on time, so we can do the video. We can possibly do the video. This is our Steam gameplay mode.
Agent incoming. Take it down. Oh my. Stay with that rocket! We're bringing out the big guns for you. As long as we survive, so does the agency. Engage aerial mode. Agent, you made it.
Yay. All right, we have plenty of time for questions. Are there any questions on the app thing? Excellent. Does anyone have any questions in real life? Yes.
Did you have to consider using different cars and having different physics for them, or was the whole game just using that one car that we saw?
Sorry, just could you ask the question and use that? That would be awesome. Thank you.
So yeah, so I was wondering, did you have to consider different physics for different cars that the player can drive as, or were they just driving as that yellow car that we saw?
Yes. So what we did was created different sets of numbers per vehicle, per surface type. So there's points where it will transition from on the tarmac to off-road. Off-road, the threshold for starting to drift is considerably lower. In fact, I think it drifts on every corner, regardless of whether you're boosting. Your maximum speed is a bit lower, and there are a few other things. And what we do is, as you move from one surface to another, it just quickly takes all of those numbers and loops them through. So you can be sliding around on a tarmac corner and then transition cleanly into a completely different surface, have different physics, but it isn't an abrupt change, which is especially important for when you're drifting around a corner into the water, where you're not where we don't have any drift at all, and we don't really want it to stop and forward. And other vehicles, the enemy vehicles also have their own sets of surface-based parameters, and there is one bit where you get to drive in one of the enemy vehicles, which is great fun. Which you'll have to buy the game in order to play. Does that answer it?
Yeah, awesome, thank you.
Cool.
I've got one for you. I think the mark of a good senior, well, really anything, but we'll
Doesn't.
talk tech. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I assumed it'd be picked up in an ambient microphone. Mark of a good senior lead is understanding when something is impossible for good reasons, it's not going to work, it's not going to be worth it, it's going to take too much effort, and when actually, no, it is possible and it's worth looking at. So can you talk through maybe your thought process of how something like the rocket ride went from that's ridiculous and impossible to, well, maybe, and those kind of decisions that come from the large experience you have?
Yeah. This one's not always a tech problem. Sometimes this is a personal relationship problem, especially if you're new on a team or if someone else is new on a team. You don't have that level of trust in your judgment to be able to say that definitely can't be done, and so you're just better off to try it, which we did, and I think pretty much every time we tried something it just kind of worked. And it sometimes required some unusual compromises, and sometimes involved code that ended up looking a lot more complicated than it ought to have. But it was only ever used in one place. And then someone would inevitably say, this is great, let's use it in more places. But yeah, try stuff. Try stuff is what we've been going with. And then when you try it and you can demonstrate, okay, it almost works, but it's a bit shit, then the person who requested it will trust you, probably. Yeah. Anything else?
After you had your solution where a road was just the z-axis, I was wondering how hard it was to have branching and reconnecting roads in the same level.
Super hard. The branching wasn't the problem. It was figuring out what the player's intention was when they hit that branch. Why did they choose? Well, if you sort of meet that Y fork, if you're on the right side of the road, does that mean you definitely want to go down that side, or do you want to go down this side but still be on the right side of the road? And we tried a lot of different ways of doing that, and they didn't work. And we ended up just putting obstacles in the middle of the road to force you to make that choice early on and say, all right, okay, I definitely want to be on this side and not hit the rock, or that side and not hit the rock, or hit the rock and have the choice made for me. Reconnecting was fine. That was easy. That was But I mean, that's a good example of something that we planned for from the beginning that just didn't work out the way that we thought it was going to work out. And the main reason is because the road turns you. As soon as the road has decided which direction you're going and starts turning you in that direction, it feels completely wrong if you were actually going for the other side. Yes.
Were you able to change the width of the road dynamically as you play, or is it like a set width that you decided for the whole level?
So the level design was able to change that width of the road. Yes.
So you could have like tunnels and stuff like that.
Oh, yep, we got tunnels. We got everything. But yes, we do change the width of the road quite a lot. It tends to stick around that width that you see in the trailer, and that's because that's what feels really nice for taking corners. Any skinnier than that, and you feel like you haven't got the control you need in order to avoid enemies or hit enemies, depending on what you're trying to do. And much wider than that, and it doesn't feel exciting anymore. We do use that in a few places where you're pursuing a submarine in boat form and there's mines popping up everywhere, and you like having that big space, but generally small feels better. But except for too small, that feels terrible.
Yeah, you mentioned that you had a rock in the middle of the road, say, coming up to a branch. What do you do, because you're kind of on rails here, right? And you're trying to have a sense of flow. What do you do when the player hits the rock head on?
Generally, we try to make sure that the rocks look pointy, so that there's something that would logically deflect you rather than a flat face where you would expect to hit it and nothing. But yeah, basically we measure the angle that you are from the center of that rock, and if you're on the left of it, we push you more to the left. If you're on the right, we push you more to the right. And we do slow you down quite a lot if you are hitting towards the front of it, but then you quickly build up your speed again as you slide off and crash. And yeah, and smoke and mirrors. Put some sparks, put some smoke, make the health bar flash. Just generally say that was a terrible idea. Why did you do that?
Do you have a spin?
We have a barrel roll, and we do have a spin in unreleased stuff that will be released, so whatever. Because it wouldn't be Spy Hunter without oil slicks. But they're not animation driven, but they are very canned. So once you've started that spin, we know exactly how you're going to come out of it, and you definitely will be facing the right way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody else?
So when you're developing the game, how do you decide whether it's a better idea to stick with the existing physics that you have and develop more levels on that side, or how do you decide, all right, now let's do something completely different and add the rocket? It's going to be a huge amount of work, but we want to do that. How do you make that decision?
Carefully. We have a budget for each level, and that budget can be split into sort of various things. And so we might say, all right, we're going to add a new weapon in this level, or we're going to add a new enemy type in this level, or we're going to drive up the side of a rocket in this level. Sketch out the prototype, get an idea for how much this feature is going to cost, and if it's going to cost too much, we steal from these things. We say, okay, we're not going to have a new enemy in this level after all, and negotiate with the product owner and make a case for this would be a really good thing to have. Can we please have it? Yeah. And sometimes it goes wrong. Sometimes things blow out, and sometimes things turn out to be really, really easy, and it's like, okay, I guess we'll just put a new enemy in as well.
Thank you.
All right. So the question that nobody asked, probably because it's quite rude, is surely all of this stuff that you've done could be done perfectly well with a physics engine if you knew what you were doing? And the answer is yes. And this is where it comes down to knowing what you know, and knowing enough to know that even though someone else who is intimately familiar with how to use a physics engine and work around the constraints and turn off the right constraints early on would be able to do it. If you're going in blind and you don't have that expertise, you can end up in a position where you've built, say, 60% of your game, and then you suddenly realize that you need to constrain the engine in a way in order to achieve this gameplay that you want for the last 40% of your game. But constraining the engine now is going to affect all of that content that you've already built, and that can be a problem. And that's where having a bespoke system where you're just adding on rather than taking off can work out better. And yes, know what you don't know. Yes.
Hello. Did you have any problems, like could you jump? And did you have problems with jumping onto other vehicles?
You can jump. Not with a jump button,
Okay.
but you can go over ramps. And if you land on a regular vehicle, then you do what is called in code pancake damage, which almost always instantly defeats them. If you're hitting a boss vehicle, then it does a fair amount of damage, but we also need to then use our collision system to push you off. When in car mode, the collisions are 2D, so the collision system won't override where you are on the y-axis. It'll just shift you so that you're landing next to the car instead of on top of it, while the other vehicle sort of gets shunted out the way a wee bit. Yeah, we did think about whether we wanted to have a jump gadget early on, but couldn't really think of situations where that was going to be useful, where you wouldn't need it and nothing else. So it didn't feel like a choice that the player would have to make. It would just be an exercise that the player had to perform at the right time. Yeah.
I think you mentioned.
Sorry, it's for actually. I mean, we were all hearing fine, but it's for the recording. So, thank you.
I think you mentioned the challenge of colliding with crates, and you said that problem was solved kind of before you were talking about the solution. What was the final solution for handling those collisions?
Do you want to send the mic over to Rob over there?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Rob, what was the solution that you came up with to get around not being able to smash through crates in cinematic ways?
I think in that case we just had you blow up like an oil tanker instead and jump straight through the middle of it in a cutscene.
Yeah.
Which is, potentially far more exciting.
Yes. And that's a good solution. If you can't have what you want, have something better. All right. I think that's us. Thank you for coming. It turns out I didn't go 20 minutes over.